Hi, it's Brandon from Arabian Armory, and today I'm going to be talking about Lamellar. More specifically, I'm going to be talking about an armor project that I'm working for Anime Central as my Masquerade entry. So, first off, what is Lamellar, and what's the difference between that and scale armor? Lamellar is armor that uses lacing. In this case, I'm using paracord as my lacing, although historically you could use leather or you could use cloth. Silk was a very good choice, but silk was very, very expensive. But you take plates that are not always rectangular in shape, although that's what I'm working with, and you lace them together. It could be body armor or limb armor. When you compare that to scale, however, the difference is that scale has a backing, although this does have a backing, so this is arguably scale, not lamellar, but that's a whole mess historically speaking. Um, but yeah, the difference would be that scale is either stitched or in some cases riveted um, or interlaced with mail, like chainmail, whereas this is specifically using lacing. Um, the backing structurally adds a little bit of support. It also makes the process of lacing it all together a bit easier. That's why I prefer it. And specifically, the character I'm doing is Mulan from the live action movie that's coming out in 2020. So they have the example to have backing. China did have examples of what is essentially otherwise lamellar but has a backing, so I'd say that's perfectly fine. Some deviations from the movie version versus historical. So first is the orientation of overlap. When you look at lamellar historically, in almost all cases, the way that the orientation was is that the bottom row overlaps the middle, overlaps the top, and it goes in that orientation. Whereas with scale armor, it did the opposite. Now, the downside of having it in this orientation is that if you're on horseback, and I don't have a blade that I want to mess with, but pliers, not a big deal. But if anything came in underneath, right, there is that concern that it will glance up between the plates and still manage to stab you. Versus if you're riding horseback and it's this orientation, it just glances off completely and doesn't do anything. Um, I don't particularly see myself fighting on horseback, so I guess in some ways it doesn't matter. But yeah, aesthetically, the way that they do it in the movie is similar to scale, as opposed to being more traditional lamellar orientation. But I'll decide exactly what I want to do in the future of this project as I get more of it done. In particular, for what this piece is, this would be the equivalent of a rear brace. So this is going to cover my bicep, my tricep, my deltoid. This by itself will not perform all three. Now, that's actually another deviation that the Chinese lamellar has historically versus what it is in the movie. So historically, this piece would probably have one more row going up, and then that would just be sitting at an angle on that shoulder joint. The way that they have it in the movie is that there is a more defined this is bicep tricep section, then there's a slanted section that seems to be laced separately to this, and then there's another section that goes over the shoulder itself that is connecting the front and back portions. The way that they did it in the movie is a little bit more similar to Roman lorica segmentata. So I haven't found any examples of Chinese armor that has that shoulder design in that orientation, but maybe it was done. I've been digging through both Qin Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, Han Dynasty, all of these different sections in Chinese history, um, going all the way back to terracotta army examples, all the way forward to like proper medieval era. And again, the way that it's done in the movie doesn't seem to be based on that. That doesn't mean that it's a bad design. It actually is, in my opinion, a bit better. It's more conforming to the body and equally allows you to have range of motion, maybe even better range of motion. It's just something to be concerned about for if you're trying to decide whether or not you, or not decide, if you're trying to assess whether or not the Mulan armor is historically accurate or not. It's close, but that is a deviation. Um, Other things. So the predominant shape of lamellar plates in China was the square or rectangle shape, although there are other examples you can get in other parts of the world. And also there was variation in China itself. You could get plates that are in the shape of like a heater shield. You can get plates that are like a capital D, and the D overlaps in one direction, and then there's a central piece that is like an oval, and then the capital D's go in the opposite orientation on the right, so it's more a symmetrical appearance. You can have a whole variety of different shapes to the plate itself. I just feel that not only is this, I mean, obviously this is based on a character from a movie, but even if I wasn't, if it was just lamellar that I wanted to make for myself in general, this is the most space efficient shape that the overlap that occurs is as much as is necessary and no more than that. Whoops. So anyways, moving on to other design aspects that I had to go into. I've been measuring this in metric. I don't like measuring with American Imperial. It's very imprecise. So this would be 16 centimeters going up vertically, and then I believe it was 36 or so going lengthwise. And let's double check that. 35. Okay, I went one short. Now, you're probably wondering as you look at this why it is I have these knots here, why I chose to do it this way, and that's just a matter of it's easier to lace it in that regard. The way that I did it is I tie a knot and then I feed the paracord down this way or up this way depending on which side I'm starting with, and then I proceed this way, loop it around here, tie another knot to the next section of paracord, and then run the second piece of paracord this way. And I just do one row at a time because that's historically how it was done. It's done like that because it's just easy to organize. The amount of overlap I have. So what you've noticed is that the overlap is rather minimal. That's accurate to some examples of armor, so that's nothing wrong with that historically. And then it's also accurate to the way it is in the movie. Some people are concerned that, well, you can flop the armor like so, which means that a blade could find its way into the gaps. And I actually am here to say no, that's really like a non-existent concern in this armor. The reason why is because the way that you have just seen it flop is when it's perfectly straight. However, when it conforms to the body, it's already resisting when I just curve it this much. I have to curve it more just to fit it around my biceps and triceps. So when it's conformed this way, this is not going to fold in at all. It doesn't want to move at all. And so it's not going to let a blade in through. And that small amount of gapping, depending on the angle, if a blade came in perfectly upwards, then that's not going to hit my muscle at all. At most, it's going to scrape my skin, which is not lethal. What's more likely is that it won't even scrape my skin. It will bunch up the clothing or backing of the leather itself and then stop. The other concern that some people have for the way that this is secured together is what happens if because I'm using paracord as opposed to using silk or leather for the cording, what happens if the paracord stretches? And I have actually accounted for that in the design phase. So the way that I did it is when it was straight, right, I took a pair of pliers, I pulled on the slack, and then I pulled on the other side, and I just kept pulling it over and over and over and over. And then I bent it and curved it. And then as that paracord stretched, I did it again, and then curved it, and I have exactly enough that it doesn't want to curve much more than this unless I force it, and then when I force it, it curves just enough that it sits to my body correctly. So having the paracord pre-stretched in that regard means it's going to sit the way it's supposed to be. However, that is not necessarily as easy to perform for the body because the body piece is obviously going to be bigger than my armor. So what you'll see for what I did in the body, and this is a workaround for using modern materials. It's not something that had to be done in the historical materials, but whenever I noticed there was a bit of slack that I just couldn't get out, I would loop up, come back down, and then I'd pull it, and it would pinch tight. That also serves the function of acting as belt loops. This is specifically going to be my hip armor, so it's going to hang from a belt in my tasset. The belt will go this way, so this is the orientation of the armor as it sits on my body. But let's say that the paracord stretches out a bit more, because I intend to fight in this, by the way, like steel combat. So let's say that it takes a lot of hits over years and years, and the paracord stretches a bit. Well, I have all of these unused loops that I can then run old paracord through, because that's why it's faded, and then tighten that, and then all the slack is gone. And hypothetically, if I fight for so long that I have run out of these loops to then add, I can then add additional loops. So if I completely ran out of horizontal sections, I could just add horizontal sections between the vertical sections, and then that tightens the horizontal sections all over again. Um, Although I feel like the leather itself would be annihilated by the time the paracord was stretched that much if I was fighting for that long while wearing this. Um, the other concerns I had for the movie design and deviations from history that I may or may not follow. Um, what you'll notice in this piece is that I have it tapered so that when it is on my body and it curves, right, it doesn't get in the way of my knees. And that's very important for me to be able to sit down, for me to run a lot, do a lot of the things that I'm doing. And in examples where that didn't taper, where it was just a complete rectangle going straight up and down, that was acting as most or all of the armor on your leg. You didn't have anything conforming to your leg itself. When I am fighting in armored combat, I intend to have a separate knee component, which is then going to be articulated to a separate thigh and shin component. It's going to be closer to what you might be familiar with for knight armor from medieval Europe, but it will still be Eastern designs. So that's why I have that change. Um, Other changes I've had to plan for are the size difference between myself and the actress that is portraying Mulan. What you'll notice is that I had an extra row for my bicep tricep armor because my arms are just longer. Some people might be concerned as to why I wouldn't just use bigger scales or lambs. Why wouldn't I use bigger lamellar plates and then have the same number of rows as what Mulan has? Well, the problem is the plate is this size for a very specific reason. So this size plate allows me to have just enough flexibility in the armor that I'm making that it conforms to my body, but no more than that, so it doesn't let a blade through. If I used bigger pieces than this, then that's going to alter the way it curves around my body. I'd have to change much more of the design. That's also going to hinder certain parts of my body from even having proper range of motion. So this size is honestly perfect. It just made more sense from a structural perspective to add another row than to just add bigger plates. Um, Another thing that I'm going to probably be doing different from the version that is done in the movie. So in the movie, on the bicep armor, there is a leather strap that is riveted to a central plate here, and then that is going to use a buckle configuration to attach to the body. The reason why I dislike that is because if you have a leather buckle and strap added to the plate itself for the armor, that means that if this row of plates needs to be replaced because it's been sufficiently damaged, or if the leather buckle and strap need to be replaced, I intrinsically cannot perform one repair without dealing with the other. Versus the way that I intend to do it is either I discreetly hide the rivet for the leather strap underneath the plate, or I just completely omit that and have it in this section here that doesn't have any metal on it. That way, either version, although the second one's going to be even easier, hypothetically, if my buckle and strap had to be replaced because they've been torn up from fighting, I can do that and I don't need to interfere at all with the metal components. Likewise, if I needed to repair this row of plates, I don't have to do anything about drilling out the rivet that secures the leather strap to then put back in later. It's just a whole mess of headaches that I don't need to deal with. Next is what the lamellar plates are made of. So the material that I have chosen is SAE 304 stainless. That is an industrial steel. It is specifically used very frequently architecturally as support brackets. The chromium content and the carbon content make it a relatively hard steel. I preferred this over aluminum because I feel that this is better historical authenticity. It's obviously closer to historical steel than aluminum, which didn't have any examples of it existing centuries upon centuries ago. Aluminum is a very recent material. Other concerns are, again, this is going to be used for armored combat, so it needs to actually be able to survive a greatsword smashing into it. But I had other options like galvanized steel, right? A galvanized steel would actually be dramatically cheaper than the stainless that I've chosen, but The reason why I dislike using galvanized steel is because the nickel content in the metal is actually going to poison you. Um, it's very common safety concern for armored combat sports of various kinds, SCA specifically, although a little bit of ACL has that same problem where if you have galvanized steel armor and that's rubbing against your body constantly, you actually have a risk of getting cancer from that. And I would rather not have that. So stainless is obviously much better for my health. Other concerns are inhaling. Inhaling metal dust is obviously very bad for you in general, but it's much worse if you inhale something that will then give you nickel poisoning, obviously. So SAE 304 stainless is a significantly better choice than galvanized. Um, Another question people are probably going to ask is this suede stuff that I'm using. Why am I using this rather than veg tanned leather? And I have veg tanned leather around here. The reason why I used suede rather than veg tanned leather, this is something that I already turned into something else, but I needed to have an appropriate amount of flexibility. What you'll notice is that this is flexible, but not terribly so. And this is incredibly flexible, like clothing. It's still thick enough that it can support the weight of this armor. It's 15 gauge steel. It's going to have weight. But this, I know for sure, will conform to my body with the rivets in it very nicely. If it needs to stretch a little bit, suede can have a little bit of stretch, and it'll still hold up together pretty well. Versus veg tan, because it's a bit stiffer, it might fight trying to conform around my body as I get to certain components. Other reasons why are this is just more readily available financially for me. Using the power of coupons, I was able to get giant sections of suede for about $1 a piece. This giant section that I used for my Tasset was essentially about $1 and some odd change. So coupons, kids, will save your life. What do I cut and punch holes with for leather? I've been using a screw hole punch, which ended up having some malfunctions to it, so I'll have to repair the tool. I've also been using a hole punch that has a variety of sizes on it, so this has been very helpful. Why do I use hole punches rather than using drills? I have used drills in the past for some projects, but I prefer hole punching. The reason why is when you drill a hole through leather, regardless if it's suede or if it's veg tan, the way that the drill works is that it's tearing in a rotation, and that generates friction. And what happens is when you drill out the hole that way, the friction that you're generating, it degrades the leather around the hole, and that means that that hole will break down even faster. So then you have to replace it with a slightly larger hole and a new rivet or a new lacing method, and then that's going to break down a little bit faster because you drill it a second time, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. People who have drilled holes for leather armor, like LARP leather armor, will probably think that I'm just making a big deal out of nothing, because to them it just means that they have to fix a couple holes every year and a half, 2 years, depending on how often they fight. The distinguishing factor that I have to bring up here is, well, if your armor, the holes will break down after about a year and a half, and that's just leather riveted to more leather. Imagine how much stress having thousands of these on the armor is going to have on that hole if it's been drilled rather than punched. That's going to break down dramatically faster because the weight of the armor combined with the impact that it's getting hit for armored combat. So yeah, if you're going to have something that needs to have intense structural support, and you need it to hold up to abuse, punch holes, don't drill holes. Yeah, if it's just LARP armor, it matters a lot less, and if it's just costume armor that's not going to get hit by anything, then it hardly matters at all. Other things about the materials I've been using. So I have this color as a smoke gray, and the other one, if you look on the front side, it's black. Obviously, in the movie, a lot of it is brown. Having brown everything is not necessarily historical. That's more of a Hollywood thing where it's like, oh, leather's always the color brown, and everyone's devoid of color. No. Part of me thinks that they wanted the focus to be on the red of the lacing aesthetically, because that's obviously a color that has a lot of historical and cultural significance for China. But yeah, having it contrast a little bit heavier with black and red, or having the smoky gray and red. That's perfectly fine historically. There's nothing wrong with this. I chose this because it just matches my own color scheme for what I tend to fight. It was also readily available for reasonably cheap. So, yeah, you don't need all your leather stuff to be brown. You don't need all of the colors of your armor and equipment in historical combat to be monotone. Monotone is not how the historical societies were, regardless if you're looking at Eastern or Western cultures. Yeah, that's where I am so far. I'm going to send some more updates to the channel whenever I get to another stage. I'm probably going to be doing the torso section within the next week or two, and then hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Before I go, I'm going to give a shout out to Josh Brownie. He's our supporter on Patreon, and if any of you want to support historical or fantasy armor projects, probably more historical stuff is what I intend to do like this, but I might do fantasy stuff in the future. Support us on Patreon for Arabian Armory. Have a good night.